sector and the nonprofit sector, as well as being in the military. And he's done everything from managing clerks and working as a change agent to leading boards of directors. He's led a lot of boards of directors, so that's his specialty as well. So he's officer, the CEO of the Deltinium Group, and also the founder of the National Leadership Institute. And so we're super lucky to have him today. And I'm going to turn it over to Jerry and have you introduce yourself to our Leadership Delray class.
Well, good morning, everybody. I, uh, I have to say that it is never easy for somebody who does presentations to do a presentation to a screen. So I know that all of you have been through this Zoom monster that we've been living with for the last over a year now. And so to the extent that I missed something that I would have picked up on in the days when I was in a room with you and could read your body language, I want to apologize to you in advance for that, because it is almost impossible for me in this situation to be able to accomplish what I really like to accomplish, which is to be able to engage with you. But to the extent that I am on a topic, no matter what I'm saying, to the extent that you want to ask a question or make a comment, start making visual noise so that I can notice you, okay? Don't be hesitant to make that visual noise, because I will obviously, and by the way, it doesn't have to just be visual. If you want to scream it out, that's fine with me too. But I really want you to understand that this business of pontificating without dialogue is not the easiest thing in the world for me to do. So to the extent that you've got something that you want to say, or a question you want to ask, or for that matter, you want to challenge me on something I've said, please don't hesitate to find a way to do that. I will get wound up and I will start saying things. And if I don't watch myself, I will ignore the fact that I can't see your noise or hear you. So please don't hesitate to do that. All right. The second thing I want to do is I want to start with a recognition that I've done enough research on the group to know that we've got a pretty broad base of people. Some of you who have had a lot of, quote, leadership experience in your past. Some of you have had little or none. But what I'm going to try to talk about today is the word leadership and what it can mean to you, no matter what your job is. And I want to talk a little bit about another word, and that is job title. And I'm going to tell you a little story. By the way, those of you who don't know it, Raylan Barlow, who is on the screen here, has put up with me and my stories for years now. And I do have a tendency to tell stories, so get ready for that. You see her head shaking over there. And so I'm going to tell you a little story about something that happened to me relatively early in my civilian working career. I was working at a bank in Chicago. At the time, it was the 8th largest bank in the country. And I had taken on, by serendipitous good fortune, I had taken on a pretty significant job in the organization, and I had gotten there pretty fast. And I was probably a little cocky. It's not to say that that's an unusual thing about me, but clearly I was doing what I considered to be an important job. And my title was manager. And I had been doing that job for a couple of years. But the fact is that if any of you have had anything, I can't remember, is there a banker in the crowd? I can't remember that I saw a banker in the crowd. That's actually kind of unusual. But the fact is that banks are loaded with titles. Those of you that don't know it, it is not an unusual circumstance to be a vice president at a bank. There are a lot of vice presidents in banks, and but I was manager. I was anything but a vice president. And so one day, the promotion list to officer in the company came out, and I had this fantasy that I should be on that list, and I wasn't. And I was more than a little irritated. And so I went to my boss, who, by the way, ultimately became probably the most important boss in my career. He became a true mentor, almost a father surrogate to me. So this guy was really important to me. Ultimately, he was the guy had more influence over me as a manager, leader, whatever I might be called, than almost anybody else in my career. So I went to him, and oh, by the way, he was also the guy who had enabled me to be able to be in this position relatively quickly. And I went to him and I said, I got into his office and I said, Gail, I got to have a conversation with you. And he said, okay, Jerry, sit down. What do you want? And I said, the promotion list came out today for officers and I'm not on it. He said, yeah, you're right. You're not. And I said, I have to tell you, that really irritates me. I think I'm due. I think there are a lot of people in this organization that have the title of officer, and I don't. And quite frankly, that just doesn't seem fair. And I know that it takes you to recommend me. So why am I not an officer? And he very quickly gave me one of his counseling sessions. Let's put it that way. But it was actually a butt chewing. And he looked at me and he said, do you like your job? And I started to swallow hard, because all of a sudden I began to think that, oh, maybe I really put myself at risk here. He said, do you like your job? I said, yes. Actually, I love my job. He said, do you think that you're important in your job? Do you think the work you do is important? And I said, yes, which is, by the way, why I think I ought to be an officer. And he said, well, for whatever it's worth, you are doing a very important job, and it's your job content that matters to me, not what you're called. And I said, but Gail, it matters in the organization. I'm a peon in the organization as a manager. I'm not an officer. He said, Jerry, has anybody ever told you that you can't do your job because you don't have a title? And I got this long speech about all of the issues around why title didn't make one whit of difference. And I left his office, one, knowing full well that I wasn't going to be an officer for a long time, because he didn't really care about this officer thing. But I did leave that office with a very critical message. And it's a message I want to drop on you. And that is, it is irrelevant what your title is. That was the point that he was making. What mattered is what's your job responsibility, how important is it, and do you enjoy doing it? And so I walked away from that experience, and it took me a little while to digest it. And I was still young enough that I still was irritated that there were other people walking around with a title that I didn't have. But I walked away from that experience learning what turns out to be a very important lesson for me. And that is, focus on the job, Jerry, not what you're called, not what other people think. Focus on the job, focus on what you do and what your impact is and what your responsibilities are. Stop thinking about what title they label you with. And so I tell you that story because I have had all kinds of titles over my career. Most of them most of them were in some ways highfalutin. You know, I've been chairman, CEO, president, executive vice president, senior vice president, vice president. I've been, you name it. And not once did having the title have any impact on whether I either enjoyed the job or whether I did a good job. Not once, not once. And it may have fed my ego once in a while to have some kind of fancy title, but it never had an impact whatsoever on what I did or where I was going and how I would evaluate my performance. And I ask you to think about the same thing. Now, there's another reason I tell that story. And the other reason that I tell that story is because I'm about to lay on you, and you all either have or will have a copy of the book that is called You're in Charge, What Now? I don't, do they have it now, Stephanie, or will they get it today?
They're in possession of it right now.
Okay, so you've seen the title, but what you may not have noticed is that on that book title, at the very top, in the book, there is.
Wait, you muted yourself, Jerry.
Success.
There you go.
And the thing that I want to stress is that the word work leader is a title, all right? But it sounds kind of icky, all right? It sounds kind of low scale. And I told you the title story because this is a title that I want everybody in this group to think is a really important title, a very special title. I happen to think it's a special title. And the reason that I think it's a special title is because the one title that I had that I never really completely was proud of was the title of executive. And I've been an executive many times in my professional career, but the title executive was never as important to me as the title of leader, and in particular, in the case that I want to talk about today, work leader. I think that probably, and I've never really done the academic research to support what I'm about to say, but I think that a good 80+% of the people in the world who have jobs and who have one characteristic about them that is important, which is in their job, they're responsible for at least one other human being and what that other human being does. So if you're a sole performer and you have no responsibility for any other human beings, it's hard to call you a leader. You may be a thought leader. As a consultant, some people might call me a thought leader, but I'm not leading anybody when I'm doing my job myself and there's nobody else around. But the moment you're responsible for one other person, you take on a leadership role. And one of the things that I like to stress, and the reason that I talk about this word work leader, is because I'm convinced that at least 80%, and it may well be higher, at least 80% of the people who think of themselves as leaders, meaning they have responsibility for another human being, at least 80% of them qualify in my definition of work leader. And I'm going to try to do something here. Can everybody see my screen now? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. All right. So that's the name of the seminar here. And that word work leader, it's actually a word I created. I fabricated it. I took the word work and leader and put them together and call people work leader. All right. So it's a Jerry word. So I'll admit to that. But what I define as a work leader, this 80% of the people who are in leadership, is an organizational leader, whatever the organization is, no matter what it is. And you kind of have to be in an organization you may form the organization yourself, but you have to be a leader of something in an organization who also does the work that he or she supervises. Now, on the cover of the book, on the back, again, if you look at the back cover of the book, and I don't really want you thumbing through the book while I'm talking, but if you look at the back of the book, you'll see a bunch of statements or examples on the back of the book of the kinds of people's jobs that I'm calling work leaders. And that type of job that's described there goes all over the ballpark. And let me disabuse you of something. One of the highest faluting in the world of business, or for that matter, not-for-profits as well, one of the highfalutin titles would be chairman of the board. And I've been chairman of the board of a number of boards. As Stephanie said, I've done a lot of that board governance stuff. And when you get on a board, you're supposed to be a hot shot, big shot. And when you're the chairman of the board, you're the biggest of big shots, all right? Well, I will tell you that as somebody who has done that job many times, it is a work leader job. No matter how big the title may sound, the person who is the chairman of the board is nothing more than a first among equals. That's a title we used to use in banking. I refer back to my banking days. Remember, I told you that everybody is a vice president in banks, it seems. All right. And I, eventually I got to be, by the way, a vice president. So Gail didn't keep me barren and without title forever. But eventually, as a vice president, I had 4 organizational layers of people who work for me, whose title was vice president. And so it became kind of a joke that how senior a vice president are you to have 4 vice presidents reporting up through each other to you. The bottom line is that as chairman of the board, you are nothing more than first among equals when it came to the business of being a board member. You are the person who leads the group, but you do all the same work that the people on the board do, all the same work. And so the point that I want to stress to everybody is that this notion of a work leader, the person who is an organizational leader who also does the work that he or she supervises, defines a very significant number of the jobs. And from what I can tell, many of you, no matter how highfalutin you think you are, and you may think you're very impressive, and that's great. Good self-concept is a good thing. But no matter what your job is, you probably qualify as a work leader. And I will tell you that the more I have thought about this concept, the more I think that it is not only the most important leadership job in an organization, it may be the toughest. And there is a reason why it's tough. And I wrote the very first article I ever wrote for a magazine. I wrote back about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years after that conversation that I just described I had with my mentor. And I'm not even sure I remember why I wrote it, but that conversation that I had got me into doing a whole lot of other different kinds of jobs in the organization. But I wrote this article, and the article was titled, "Can the Clerk Supervise?" And it was an article for a banking magazine, and it was for operations people, because at that time I was heavily involved in the operations of the bank. And I wrote this article with the title, "Can a Clerk Supervise?" And the very first sentence was the answer to the question, which was no, the clerk can't supervise. And the message in that article is one that I actually want to leave with you here. And that it's where I want to start the discussion that we have today. The fundamental fact is that when you are doing the work of whatever it is your specialty or technical capacity is, when you're doing the work, you're getting rewarded for the quality of what you do. And people who are successful, let's say as clerks, who get promoted to supervisor, are about to take the most difficult journey of their entire professional career, which is to start feeling good, not about how good you are at the work you do, but how good the people who work for you do their work. How well do they perform at the job? So you transition from being proud of what you do to being proud of what they do. And this is the hardest transition for people who are individual performers. And when I say individual performers, I'm not talking about just clerks. When you take a great lawyer and you say, great lawyer, I'm going to give you a team of lawyers. And with that team of lawyers, you're going to run the practice for corporate mergers and acquisitions. All right. And so you're now going to have 5 lawyers reporting to you, and we're a major law firm. And those 5 lawyers who report to you are professional lawyers in the mergers and acquisitions business. And by golly, you are now in charge of the business. You're a big shot. All right. The problem is that the moment that that person was promoted to that job as leader of those other 5 M&A people, they had to now not just do mergers and acquisition work themselves, but they had to have a team that they could proudly say each and every one of them are doing a great job, and it's because I'm their leader that they're doing it. Not because I can compete with them and do a better job than they do, but because I'm their leader and I get my satisfaction knowing that they do a great job. That is the role that a leader has to play. And it is the hardest transition that a professional ever goes through, which is to be responsible for another group of people who do exactly what you do. Whether you're a systems analyst, whether you're a hair salon manager and you manage stylists, it does not matter. Whether you're a marketing specialist and you are in fact responsible for 3 other people who put together the marketing plan for the organization, whether you're a supervisor of people who are building a construction project, but you're also out there doing the work with them. It doesn't matter what the job is. If you've got people that are working, that you're working side by side with, you're now their leader. Your goal has to be for them to be great, not just for you to be great. And it's a tough transition. And that's what drove me to write this book. And by the way, the book that you have in front of you is a quote 2nd edition. This book actually is the first book that I wrote. It's been updated and actually it's been expanded, and I'll explain the expansion later. But the book came out of the struggle I had as a work leader. The struggle I had as a work leader and the struggle I had with others who I was helping to become work leaders. Because one of the responsibilities I had during those early days in that bank was to train supervisors or other work leaders. And so when I got to that position, I realized how difficult this process was to make the shift. And so one of the reasons why I wrote this book was to try to help people who move into a leadership job or who are in a leadership job and who are struggling with their success. And that's where this book comes from. And so what I ultimately tried to do in this book was to make the role of the leader a little simpler, but more importantly, to reinforce the fact that being a leader is all about how you help them succeed, not how you succeed. Their success makes you successful, but it's your job to make them succeed, to make them put them in an environment where you help them achieve excellence. That is a totally different kind of a job than being a great systems analyst or a great programmer who can manage to do the best darn code there is. And all of a sudden, you get promoted in charge of others who are responsible for coding, and you still are the rock star coder in the group. Well, being the rock star coder as the leader of a group of coders is not your job. You may be a rock star and you may be fantastic at it, but your job is to make everybody who works for you capable of being a rock star themselves. That changes your entire focus. Everything you do then all of a sudden becomes focused on somebody else, not on yourself. So when we make the transition from self to others, that transition is hugely difficult. And it is a transition that I believe is the single most significant transition we go through. There is a second transition, by the way, just to make a comment to you. And those who finally get to the point where they aren't a work leader and they are responsible for a whole bunch of other people who have responsibility for other people, call them general managers, or I hate that term, but call them an executive. The whole business of moving from being a manager to being a manager of managers, that's the second tough transition that goes on in your life. And when you so when you get to the point where you're a manager of other managers, you have a whole new set of skills you have to learn that are different from these skills. Some of these apply, but they're different from these skills because now all of a sudden you are not doing the work anymore. You are overseeing people who are doing the work and overseeing the workers themselves. And that changes how you have to behave. But that's not what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about today is what 80 to 90% of us, including Jerry, when he's chairman of the board, how does Jerry have to behave as a work leader? Because this notion of first among equals is kind of appropriate. If you're working side by side with a group of people and it's your job to be overseeing their performance or facilitating their success, you have to continue to be doing your job effectively, but you also have to learn how to be their leader. And so one of the things that I started with when I wrote the first copy or version of this book is I started with a mnemonic. And this is the mnemonic that we're going to use in this session. And what's a mnemonic? It's nothing more than a bunch of letters strung together that makes a word, and each of the letters is going to mean something. All right. So each of these letters is going to represent the 10 essential steps for work leader success. Notice that work leader word there. And each letter will stand for a word which represents one of those 10 steps. So, by the way, just for your edification, not that it really matters, but it turns out that when I wrote the first version of You're in Charge What Now, the first version stopped with leader. It stopped with leader. So the first version of the book, the mnemonic was leader. And it became leadership when I had about 10 or 15 years worth of experience with the book, and I decided that I needed to expand the thought process. And I will explain a little bit about that a little later on as we get through this list. So what I want to start with is the first letter in leadership. All right. That L is probably the most inflammatory, the most out of the box thinking that I come up with in this book and in this presentation today. And the reason it's out of the box or it's out of thinking is because, in my opinion, one of the most deadly problems that we face as leaders is that we have a tendency to misinterpret what our human emotional relationship needs to be with the people we're responsible for. And let me give you a little story. Again, I've warned you, I tell stories. I encountered in an interview for an applicant for a job a long time ago, way back, still when I was in that bank in Chicago. I did an interview for a supervisor role, and this interview went like so many other interviews that I had, and I said to the person, I asked the person, tell me why you think you'd be a good supervisor. What is it that you think would make you a good supervisor? And I have to be honest with you, I kind of knew what the answer was going to be, because I'd asked that question of so many other candidates so many times, and it was like everybody seemed like they felt like they had to give me this answer. All right, and the answer almost always was, well, the first thing I can say is that I know I'll be a good supervisor because I like people. And people like me. And that answer almost always made me choke. It made me worry immediately. And the reason it made me worry, not just because, look, if you don't like or have the capacity to like people, then you're probably a loner. And if you're a loner, clearly you need to be off in a corner working by yourself, or not working at all and being in a forest somewhere, walking the trail. But being a leader, if you're a loner, is an obvious oxymoron. It just doesn't work. All right. But what I came to believe, and still believe more often than not, is that one of the most serious mistakes we can make as a leader is to like our people. Now, you say, Jerry, you just told me you needed to be able to like people in order to be effective as a leader. You can't be a loner. It isn't the liking itself that is the problem. It's how it translates into how you behave with your people. And the best way I can describe the problem is, if you like person A, what if you dislike person B? What if you have 10 people working for you, you like 7 of them and 3 of them you dislike? It's easy to dislike somebody. As you say to yourself, I don't like that person. That person just gets under my skin, right? And when you ask the question of how does that person perform, I can tell you that my experience is that the vast majority of the people that I disliked, I didn't think very highly of their performance. And the vast majority of the people that I liked, I thought very highly of their performance. And the problem is it wasn't always clear that the best performers were the ones I liked. I made too many mistakes with people that I liked, thinking that they were good, when in fact what really happened was that I liked them so much I overlooked their mistakes. I overlooked their shortfalls. And in the same way, the ones I disliked, I overlooked their success and their performance characteristics. We get biased because of our liking or disliking. And our job as leaders is to not be biased. Our job as leaders is to be as objective and caring about the people as we can, but to recognize their performance, not whether we like them or not. Give you a story on top of a story here. I was in Texas at a bank in Texas, and I had a guy working for me who was a marketing guru, but he was doing market research work for me. And I was, quote, responsible for a bunch of different functions. And I really had an enormous like for this guy. He was just one of the most likable guys I had ever known. And I had him work for me for a good year and a half. And then I left that bank and I took over as the CEO of another bank. Actually, the bank was in Hawaii. And when I got there, I needed a marketing executive to come in and transform the marketing business because I was unhappy with the marketing strategy that we had. And so I hired that guy, moved him and his family to Hawaii to become the senior vice president of marketing, title, there it was, title, bank title again. And I hired him to be the senior vice president of marketing in that bank. 6 months later, I had to fire him. 6 months later, he had done so badly in that job that I had to look him in the eye and say, Michael, this is not working. 6 months. And when I looked back on that experience, and I've looked back on it many times over the years, the problem I had with Michael was that I liked him too much. I liked him too much, and I overlooked. I didn't even ask the questions that I should have been asking about what's he really good at. He was good at being likable, but he was not very good at executing. And I didn't see it because I was blinded by my liking. By the way, I've got stories about people I disliked and how I was blinded by my disliking them when in fact they were really rock stars. But this story is a touching story because I had to look that guy in the eye. I had moved him from Texas to Hawaii, disrupted his entire life. And 6 months later, I had to tell him that he had failed. It was that short a period of time. That's why I use the word love instead of like. The reason that the L stands for love is because friends like people, leaders have to love their staff. And what I mean by love, I'm not talking about the whole kind of erotic love that goes on that gets you into trouble for loving your staff. I'm talking about the loving them as human beings. Not liking them as a friend or as a likable person, but caring about them above and beyond just whether they're likable or not, but caring about them simply because they're a human being and you care about human beings. And you love human beings because they are human and because you have a responsibility to them as humans. That experience with that man that I brought with me, in essence, brought with me from Texas, was a painful learning experience for me because I had supposedly already knew this. I had been teaching this concept of loving versus liking for years before I wrote this book, and certainly before I went to Hawaii to be CEO of that bank. But the bottom line is I forgot it. I forgot it because I allowed my liking to color my evaluation of his performance. So I leave you with this message. Remember the subtitle of this chapter, Friends Like. I have a friend relationship with that guy and didn't know it. I had a friend relationship with him. I had a human, personal friend relationship with him, and I forgot it. And that's not my job. My job is not to be the friend of people who work for me. My job is to be their loving boss. And I blew it. And I have been beating myself up about what I did to disrupt that guy's life for a long time, because it was a painful example of how you make a mistake when you get this liking business in the way of your objectivity, in the way of your caring, not just as to their personality, but as to the entirety of the person. So please don't forget this part of the book. And there's no doubt about it. Every time I go through the love, there's always some cynic in the room, and there's probably at least a couple of you there who's saying, he's using that word love to be inflammatory. And the answer is, I'm actually not. I actually want you to embrace the concept of caring about people so much that you actually love them as human beings. Because once you have that deep a concern for them, then you will be able to be both constructive and supportive of them, no matter what your perspective is on their personality. So all I can say is, I start this book out with L, because if you can't do this, you're probably going to be making mistakes like I did with that guy, and you'll have to live with it, quite frankly, for the rest of your life, because I really messed his life up. I really messed his life up. And that was grossly unfair to him. E, I will tell you that I don't know how I got lucky enough. And I say that when I started writing this book, with ideas in mind about what I wanted to communicate. I did not start writing this book with the use of a mnemonic. But by the time I got finished, the first several chapters of the book, I realized that although the words may have been different, I realized that I could use a mnemonic, and that the second most important thing that I, as a leader, had to do beyond caring so much about them that I love them is that I had to be able to know that we had a clear understanding. We, the person who works for me, and I had a clear understanding of what my and our expectations were of their performance. And I have to tell you that if you don't start out every new job you have, and I've quite frankly had a lot of different kinds of jobs and a lot of different businesses. And if you don't start out with the people who you work with, who you theoretically are their work leader, if you don't start out with a clear understanding of the expectations of you, yourself, your organization, and in fact, how those expectations translate down to the people who work for you, you're off to a bad start. Because quite frankly, it is clear that somebody is looking to you to accomplish something. As a work leader, you have the responsibility for those people for a reason. They've laid out what your mission is. And what your mission is a set of expectations they've got of you and your section, your group, your division, whatever it's called. Your organizational entity has expectations placed on it. And in turn, if those expectations don't cascade down to the people who work for you, and you don't make it clear what those expectations are, you're off to a terrible start. And in addition, by setting the bar, it sets the entire tone for what goes on. If you don't make clear what you expect from the people you have, how are they supposed to know what they're expected to do other than to guess? And I have to be honest with you, even as a new CEO of a company, running an entire business, whatever it might be, I took this lesson that I was preaching to work leaders with me in that job, and to make sure that when I took the job, I knew what the board wanted me to do, what they expected of me. And by the way, a couple of jobs that I interviewed for, I actually walked away from the job because I realized that I couldn't achieve what their expectations were, or at least I concluded that I couldn't achieve what their expectations were. So in my mind, knowing what your expectations are has to translate into a set of expectations that people work for you, and you owe that to them. That's something that you set the tone for with your relationship with them. They know where they stand. They know what you expect. And therefore, if they really care about success, they're going to remember the expectations. And if they're any good at all, they're going to meet them. And if they have problems meeting them, they're going to know that they're not there yet, and you're going to know that they're not there yet. So setting the bar sets the tone, and setting the relationship of the expectations that you have with somebody who works for you is the best place to start a relationship with somebody who works for you. If you don't have that in place, you will pay the price. Now, this next letter has to do with really understanding people, in my opinion, because I cannot tell you how many times I've inherited a group of people when I went into a new job. And I cannot tell you how many times I went into that new job and I concluded that person A, who is in a really important job, no matter what it is, had the wrong assignment. They were in fact either in the wrong job, or they were expected to do jobs that were not ones that they either liked or were capable of doing. And so one of the things that I stress for every work leader is make sure that the people who are in the jobs that are working for you are really properly assigned. Make sure they have the skills to be able to achieve your expectations. Remember, it starts with expectations. If they and you know what the expectations are, then you have a responsibility to make sure that their skill set matches your expectations. And if it doesn't, then it's an assignment problem. And trust me, you cannot fit a square peg into a round hole. It just doesn't work. Now, you can put a tiny little square peg into a big round hole, and they'll float around, but they won't meet the expectations of the round hole. And again, a story. I had a guy who worked for me about 15 years ago, and he was a spectacular systems analyst. The guy was a rock star. And by the way, I was still a work leader at that time. And he was a rock star, and I was totally in awe of his capacity to do systems analysis work. And it wasn't just, by the way, it wasn't just computer systems. It was how to analyze systems, evaluate them, restructure them, and build a new path, a new pathway. Well, he was so good at it that one day I called him into my office and I said, Joe, I am going to put you in charge of systems analysis because I just got promoted and I'm now responsible for all of the automation capabilities in this organization. I've got responsibility for the data center. I got responsibility for systems, programming, et cetera. So I need somebody to run systems and you're my man. Well, he was delighted. Couldn't have been happier. Within 6 months, I realized I had put a square peg into a round hole. And it was a painful experience to have to say, Joe, I think you need to go back to being a systems analyst. I'm going to bring in somebody else to run the section. By the way, Joe eventually left. I lost the best systems analyst because I had promoted him and I had concluded he was a square peg in a round hole. Why? Well, it turns out he just did not have leadership skills. He couldn't do a lot of the things that we're going to talk about here. He didn't have a problem with loving versus liking. He had a problem with a whole bunch of other things that he just couldn't get his head wrapped around because it wasn't something he enjoyed doing. He was a mismatch, and I messed it up. Tough learning experience. We have to be responsible for making sure that we have the right people doing the right jobs. And that's a major part of our responsibility as a leader in an organization. But there was something that I did
Jerry,
not really.
I have a question.
Sure.
You said to interrupt. It's Raylan, and I said I was going to stay quiet this whole time. I lied.
Yes, you did, but you never do. So it's go ahead. It's nothing new.
All right. Thanks for saying that in front of my classmates. Appreciate that. No. So in terms of assignment, a question for you. I had a situation as a leader where an employee was wonderful attitude. Everybody loved this person across the board, our customers, clients, myself, our staff, wonderful person, but the skill set wasn't there. And I was coached by peers to keep this person as an employee because you, quote, can't train attitude. The attitude was fantastic. The energy was fantastic. It was a wonderful person, but the skill set was square peg, round hole. And I stuck with that person for a very long time. So my question is, how soon do you recognize and take action when you've got a wonderful personality that is loved by your customers, clients, and staff?
Well, Raylene, you already know the answer that I'm going to give. So you're teeing up an answer that you know the answer to. I will answer it this way. As soon as you know, act. One of the things that I learned relatively early from my mentor, this guy that I was talking about earlier, was that acting too slowly costs everybody a lot of pain. In fact, my mentor, this guy that I truly loved, I mean, to be honest with you, he really was a surrogate father for me. It was at a time in my life where I relied on him to help me grow, to be ready, and we had an incredible relationship. But he had the problem that you just described. He had the problem of not being able to pull the plug on somebody who was failing. And your interruption comes just at one slide too early because his problem was that he was convinced, as by the way was I for a long period of time, that I know that they may not be up to it, but I can get them there. I can get them there. I'm going to work my heart out and I'm going to help them succeed. That's the development responsibility that I was about to talk about. All right. There is no doubt about it that helping people achieve, developing them is a critical role that we as leaders have. But notice what the subtitle says. This subtitle comes from that observation, comes from the answer to your question, Raylin. The subtitle says, the good get better, the best excel. It doesn't say, I fix the weak. It doesn't say, I transform a failure into a success. Here comes the tough guy, Jerry. All right. Get ready for this because some of you are going to object to what I'm about to say. I have a story about it, but I'm not going to tell the story this time. I'll pass on the story. But I learned the hard way. That if you try to take somebody who is super weak and transform them into a performer, you are going to spend so much time trying to do that all the people who are good, better, are never going to get the best because you're going to spend all your time on the weak one. So the answer is, you don't have time to transform a failure into a success. Somebody who is so weak that they are not going to make it, didn't have the skills, and that you can't transform it overnight, you're going to spend unbelievable amounts of time on it, and the probability of success is extremely low. So put your money where it best pays off. That's the hard idea. That's the tough idea. You have to invest where you get the best return. And we're not in the social working business. As leaders, we're not social workers. As leaders, we're responsible for achieving success, and it's our responsibility to help the people to achieve success and excellence. It's not our responsibility to transform somebody from weak and inadequate into barely adequate. That's a hard-nosed attitude. It's tough, I know. And I tell you, early in my career, I tried many times to transform people who didn't have it into somebody who could succeed. And I cannot remember a real success story. Now, maybe I had one and I've repressed it, but I can't remember one. And when I talked about my mentor, he had one guy. I will tell this part of the story. He had one guy of the direct reports that we had. He had one guy who was a direct report who all of us knew he couldn't do the job. Everybody who reported to my mentor knew that this guy, Lou, that was his first name, and that really was his first name. So if Lou is anywhere around, he knows I'm talking about him. Lou was over his head. He was a nice guy. We all liked him. He was smart, but he was over his head in that job. And Gail, my mentor, couldn't pull the plug. He couldn't pull the plug. He couldn't say, Lou, this is the wrong job for you. And ultimately, Lou's failure cost my boss a lot of credibility in the organization. It actually cost him credibility in the organization for a period of time because everybody in the firm knew Lou couldn't get his job done. So my view is this is the tough stuff. And so Ray Lynn's question is a really important question because it means that we have to know, like I talked about Mike, the guy that I moved to Hawaii, 6 months. Actually, I knew at 3 months. So I waited 3 more months to help him try to succeed. And I also just couldn't bring myself to terminate him after only 3 months. I had to make some commitment to help him. But it all started with my not understanding what I thought of him and why I thought of it. So the answer is, you are not a social worker as a leader. You do need to have social working skills because there are people you have to help develop, but you're going to invest in the people who are good so they can get better. You're not going to invest in the people who are failing so that they can succeed. Thank you for jumping ahead of me, Ray Lynn. I appreciate it. Okay, so there's another E, all right? And I will tell you, I think that of all the things I'm going to talk about today, this is the hardest thing for a leader to do. Other than pulling the plug like I did on Michael after 6 months, all right? This is the hardest thing to do. And the reason it's hard is because the word is evaluation. The word is you have to make judgments about people. And, you know, we're living in a society where we're not supposed to be judgmental. In my opinion, that's hogwash. Hogwash, sheer, unadulterated hogwash. Leaders are, in fact, leaders only succeed by making judgments about the people who work for them. That is a major part of our job. It is our responsibility to make a judgment about how somebody's performing. And I have to tell you, as long as I've been in the leadership role, like all of you, like all of you, I suspect everybody has had this emotion. Every time I had to sit down and give a performance review, I had to get my head wrapped around the fact that it was going to be tough for me. I had to get my head wrapped around the fact that this is not going to be fun. And I can tell you, because we all know that, because we all have that kind of sense of anxiety, and it's not because society says we shouldn't be judgmental, it's because we know that being judgmental, we're going to have to tell people sometimes something they don't want to hear. And we have to be prepared for either they're refusing to listen to it because they don't want to hear it, or more importantly, we have to be prepared for the fact that they're going to tell us, I don't agree with you. You're full of, that's not true. That's not true about me. You just don't know me. I'd like to know if there's anybody in this room that has ever had a performance appraisal that had at least one critical piece of feedback where the individual said, I agree with you, and it's something that I really need to work on. But I appreciate you bringing it to my attention. Doesn't happen very often. It doesn't happen very often, mostly because most of us have a hard time looking in that mirror and seeing who we are. It's hard for us as human beings. I do have a story. I had a woman who was my CFO in a bank. She was by far and away the best CFO I ever had work for me. She was hardworking, smart, loyal, and when I gave her something to do, it got done. She knew her job. She knew what was expected of her, and I could count on her. She was always there. It was fantastic. All right. So it was performance appraisal time. And I wrote up her performance appraisal. By the way, that could be a whole session about what is a performance appraisal and when you do them. But for the moment, let's assume that I'm doing one of those traditional performance appraisals. So I wrote up a performance appraisal. I had her come into my office and I walked her through my performance appraisal. I gave her the highest score and some of the most laudatory comments I have ever given on a performance appraisal. And that's unusual because I'm usually pretty tough. I'm a tough evaluator, all right? And I really struggled to hold back. I didn't want to go overboard with it, but I mean, this woman did a great job. But she had a couple of things that she needed to work on. One was she had a tendency to get defensive. If somebody challenged her, she was so cocky, so self-confident that she would have a tendency to get defensive and maybe even a tad abrasive when somebody challenged something that she had done or something that her organization had done. And so I did my performance appraisal feedback on that. And I said, Robin, this is an area where, as great as I think you are, this is an area where I think you need to spend some time working on how you deal with this business, because it's every once in a while, you create a confrontation with people that didn't need to exist. And you need to deal with this defensiveness thing and recognize that you're great, but sometimes you don't do something exactly the way somebody else thought it ought to be done. In fact, you do it with me once in a while. Well, she came unglued. I thought this was going to be the best time I've ever had. I thought this was going to break the mold. of my anxiety. I had zero anxiety going into this session with her. It was one of the few times I went into a performance review session where I thought there was zero, and she came unglued on me. And an hour later, we were still talking about that comment. 2 days later, I got a 5-page single-spaced email telling me why I was wrong. Totally overreacted to my positive feedback on everything else. This one piece of feedback, she just was not going to buy. So the bottom line is, I've concluded that even when I gave probably one of the very best performance appraisals, I have to be prepared for the fact that somewhere along the line, somebody I'm giving feedback to is going to say, I don't agree with you. So for me, performance appraisals are not easy. They're not easy. I don't take them lightly, but they're not easy. They can be painful, because if she could give me that kind of feedback, imagine the kind of feedback I probably have had when I've told somebody that this is an area where you're just not doing an acceptable job. So this business of evaluation is a really tough part of our job. But if we don't come clean with how we feel about the performance against those expectations we started with, how are we ever going to be able to have a successful performance by somebody if they don't know where they're doing well and where they're not doing well? And by the way, legally, if you don't give people reasonable feedback and you can't go through a constructive development process, back to that D just a moment ago, then how in the devil are you going to be able to justify saying you're gone if that's what you have to do? So this feedback process, this making judgments about people, whether we like it or not, it is an important part of what we do. And I happen to think it's a very difficult part of what we do. But it's the part that you've got to do. You've got to be able to say to a person, you don't have the skills necessary to do this job. And you either have to get those skills or I'm going to have to put you in a different job. You owe it to them. And this is the part where I want to make mention of a book that was written a long time ago and say that there's an awful lot of applicability of that book and being a good leader. There was a book written about parenting many years ago. I don't even know if it's still on the shelves these days. It should be. It was a book about parenting, and the name of the book was Tough Love. And the book's name basically talked about the entitled message in the book. And the entitled message in the book was, if I love my kids, I have to be able to help them learn how to live in society. I have to help them grow, and I have to be tough about that. If they make a mistake, I can't let them off the hook. If they do something wrong, I can't let them off the hook. They have to be accountable for what they do. And that, unfortunately, that message of tough love is exactly my message in this evaluation test. The fact is, if you aren't tough with the people you love, then you obviously don't love them enough to be their boss. Because that's the part that you have to deal with, is I owe it to you to know how I feel you are performing. And my evaluation, it has to be objective, but my evaluation has to be clear and unambiguous and honest if I'm going to be of any help to you to be able to deal with what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. So in my opinion, this evaluation thing is the toughest part of the job, but without it, we fail the people that we supposedly love, back to L, because we owe them the ability to become better than they are. And the only way they're going to know that is if we tell them. And now I happen to believe, by the way, and this, I said, this is a subject of an entire new 1-hour session, but I happen to believe that it is important that you give feedback on issues about their performance now, not 6 months later. If somebody screws up today, they need to know about it today. They don't need to hear about it in a performance appraisal a year from now. That was what was wrong with that performance I had with Robin. I had not talked to Robin about this problem she had since the last performance appraisal. I hadn't had a conversation with her. I just got what I deserved from Robin because I blindsided her with that piece of feedback. Instead of saying, Robin, come here, let's talk about what you just did. Let's have a conversation about how you reacted to Frank. We need to talk a little bit about how you reacted to Frank, because I think you overreacted. And I don't want you to make that mistake again. Let's talk about why you did that. Let's talk about what you can do and how could you have handled it differently. So the mistake I made with Robin, I got what I deserved with Robin because I had not taken the time to give her feedback in between. And why hadn't I? I will tell you why I hadn't. This is one I haven't admitted very often. I liked her too much. I liked her too much. She was so good at so many things that I overlooked this. And the real reason that I was talking about it then was because I had just had, about 2 or 3 weeks before, I just had somebody come in and complain to me about her defensiveness. And I knew it was there all along, but I was overlooking it because I liked her too much. Shame on me. Didn't even listen to my own lesson. Okay, so that evaluation thing, I talked a lot about feedback, and more often than not, it's feedback that's not positive, all right? Well, this one is the critical difference between a good leader and maybe a bad leader, all right? We need to recognize, I could have used the word recognize, I used the word reward. We need to recognize performance. This little subtitle, I always admit, I stole this subtitle from my mentor. He had one little sign on his credenza, and it was this statement: an organization elicits the behavior it rewards. He had a little sign on the back of his credenza, and when you walked into his office, it was there, big and bold, and you couldn't avoid it. It was going to stare you in the face. When you're sitting in the front of his desk, I guarantee you were going to read that sign. It was just big enough so that you couldn't avoid it. And I stole it. All right. Why did I steal it? I stole it because what I learned from my boss, that mentor I had, was that the truth of that saying was phenomenal. The truth of that saying is that if I reward you for doing something, you will do more of it. That you will do more of it. It's Pavlov. Some of you probably heard about Pavlov. Pavlov taught us that conditioning happens to all beings, dogs and humans. And if every day you get up and you do something and you get rewarded for doing it, you're going to do more of it. So the key to getting behavior you want is to reward it, not to punish it, reward it. Because with punishment comes pain. It's better to avoid the pain and to move towards the reward that is pleasurable. So if you want to condition people to do things well, then reward them for when they do them well. Stroke them, reward them, tell them they did a great job. The attaboy, attagirl, do that on the spot. Like I said earlier, Don't put off the feedback. Do it now. But reward them. Avoid punishment as much as you can. Reward them. Now, there is one thing I'm going to end, and then we're going to take a little break. One thing I want to end this session with, this section of the session on, is a piece of advice about this concept of the organization elicits the behavior awards. Because my boss, actually, in all candor, that mentor of mine, he wasn't that great at giving rewards. He really wasn't that great at it. I don't remember more than a handful of times where he looked at me and said, "Jerry, you did a great job." Didn't happen very often. All right. And I told you he didn't give me my title when I wanted it. So he sure as heck didn't give me the reward of the title. He made me wait for several years before he made me an officer of the company. When he finally got to the point where he realized that I was not going to talk about it ever again, that was when he gave me the title. All right. But he was not all that great at rewarding. But he believed in this concept with a passion and a fervor that would probably be puzzling to you. So if he didn't give you that many rewards, Jerry, then how could he have been such a believer in it? He believed that organizations elicit the behavior they reward, and all too often they reward the wrong behavior. So when you promote somebody, when in fact they've done a lousy job, you've promoted them and you've rewarded and you've elicited the behavior of failure, not the behavior of success. So the key point he was trying to make here is, yes, it works. Rewards are good. By the way, he took care of me. He rewarded me. But the attaboy, attagirl stuff was not something he was particularly good at, but he took care of me, and he flew air cover for me all the time. All the dumb mistakes I made, he kept me out of trouble, all right? But his message was, don't reward the wrong behavior, because if you do, you're going to get more of it. So his message was, reward the right behavior, don't reward the wrong behavior. That's why I stole this message from him, because it's got a dual message. Stroke and reward what you want. Don't stroke and reward what you're avoiding. A critical part. Okay, I've been babbling here for a while. Before we take a break, does anybody besides Raylyn have a question? Raylyn's not allowed to ask another question. She's got her question for the day. Does anybody else have a question they want to ask?
Just a quick question. If you
Sure.
overlook, as you say, like the bad behavior, is that really rewarding the bad behavior?
Yes.
You get more of it.
Absolutely.
Nip
If
it in the
you
bud.
overlook it, you're basically saying it's not important enough, and so you can continue to do it.
Yeah, they'll keep doing it. Got it.
And they'll keep doing it. The bottom line is that that's, in essence, it's a reward. Because if I continue to keep you in your job and you continue to behave badly, then badly is not badly. Badly is good.
And
That's
that
how I
affects the whole
process
team.
it. I process it as, well, my boss doesn't say anything about it, so I guess my boss thinks it's okay. So I'll do more of it.
And then it in turn affects the whole team as well.
You got it. That's the key. That you put your finger on it completely. That is such an important part of the message. And that is that, remember I said that everybody knew Lou couldn't do the job? The whole team was demoralized. By the way, I was seriously impacted by it because Lou was in charge of systems development for the entire company, and his project management skills over projects for the part of the company I ran was so bad, I was getting grief from my customers for not getting the projects done in time. So I was furious with him, right? And my boss wouldn't do anything about it. I'd go in there and I'd say, Gail, you've got to deal with this. they're failing. They're not doing the project. And Gail would say, well, he's working his heart out, right? And he just couldn't get past it. Well, the morale of the team as a whole was terrible. We were all upset. We talk about it all the time. So our morale was terrible. Eventually, Gail dealt with it, but it was way too late. Any other questions?
Jerry?
Okay, so okay, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Phil DiCarlo here. Thank you so far. I've been glued to what you've been talking about. I can't wait to hear the ship part, so I know you're going to get back. But
yeah.
On the book that you talked about, Tough Love, who's the author? Because I did a quick search, and there's several authors, so I just want to make sure I'm picking up the right one.
To be honest with you, I don't know, but while we're on break, I will look and see if I can find it.
Okay.
It's in that library behind me.
Oh,
but
no,
I know I
great.
won't find it. The fact is, I just moved, and this library, I put those books up in a hurry.
No worries. Even after the meeting, it's fine. I was just curious which one.
It's up there somewhere, but I'll have to see if I can find it on the web. Okay.
You can send it after a later date. It's fine. Thank you.
And I may do that.
Appreciate it.
Okay. So let's take a 5-minute break. I know you'll probably take more than that, but let's take 5 so you can kind of do a little bio break if you'd like, and then we'll come back and start again. Okay.
Okay, so shoot for 11 o'clock, everyone, and then we'll do the ship part, as Philip called it.
It is P, not T.
All right, see you in about 5 minutes, everyone.
Okay, good deal. Take care.
Can I ask you a question while we're waiting for everybody to kind of
Sure.
come?
Fire away, fire away.
So thank you so much for today. I'm in a leadership role. I have been for a long part of my professional career. And so I just, when it's, in normal situations, right? Where we don't have pandemic and, we don't have the major things. The point that you raised about acting too slowly causes pain to everyone is so true. Just by default, you try to find the best that you can in the team that you have and, kind of fit the pieces where they need to be to really do well for the entire organization. But more so, I'm just curious, have you seen any additional, or can you give us any additional insight as to, in an abnormal situation such as the past year of this pandemic, any insight as to how to make these changes work, or do you have anything to share regarding the challenges of that, or is it pretty much no matter what the situation is, these are the key fundamentals and you can't really shift too far off of them?
Well, actually, I think it's a great question because let's face it, all of us have lived through a year's worth of this.
Yeah.
And so we are now conditioned. I refuse to call it a new normal, but there are elements of a new normal here. All right.
Right. Yeah.
And so we've all been through some really pretty significant shifts. And I think there are some differences, and I actually probably ought to start trying to catalog them and talk a little bit more about them. I think that here are a couple of thoughts. One is we may have extended the time that we're going to actually be able to evaluate whether somebody is going to make it or not. So that when I talk about don't take too long, relative to what it was like back when we were all more often than not face-to-face, day in and day out, particularly the vast majority of work leaders prior to COVID went to work every day with their team.
Right.
And that human interaction that happens face-to-face, day in and day out, probably helps to accelerate the time where you can make a judgment.
Right.
So I think you're right. It probably has stretched out the time when we actually know whether in fact the person is going to make it or not make it. So I think that's a valid issue that I think we're going to have to come to grips with, because it just because it stretches out the time because we don't have the amount of interface doesn't mean that we should be stretching out the time.
Right.
We may have to find other ways to be able to make those evaluations. Secondly, is that I think, and I really like this question. I'm going to have to think about it more, because I think that you've put your finger on some really interesting elements here. I think there's a second point that comes to my mind immediately, which is it stresses even more than perhaps before the need for monitoring metrics on performance.
Yes.
Because you can't get a feel, the management by wandering around, MBWA. If you've been in the management business for any period of time, you've heard about MBWA, all right? Well, we can't wander around the way we did before, all right? And so a lot of the stuff that I used to do about wandering around gave me a feel for how you were doing. Well, if I'm not wandering around, I'm not even getting that feel. So the commitment and focus on metrics is going to actually be even more important than perhaps it was before. So I think there's at least two right there that come to my mind. Plus, when we are not face-to-face, day in and day out, the on-the-spot recognition of a mistake is harder to see because you're not there to see it, all right?
Yeah.
And so as an example, if you have a call center working for you and you're not with the call center, then you may have to do a significant amount more monitoring of what's going on in the calls to be able to get a sense of whether they are behaving the right way on the calls. So just as an example. So I think it's a really good question, and I'm going to have to think about it. But there's three things that come to my mind immediately that are clearly going to have an impact. And quite frankly, when we get to the next stage of this presentation, the next letter is actually going to be important in answering your question. So we'll see whether I succeed there.
Okay.
Stephanie, she asked a question that's such a good question. I'm sorry that I hope everybody was here to hear it, because it's worth thinking a lot about. And so anyway, so let me get started by saying quickly that I'm going to run through these last few because I'm going to make that deadline come hell or high water. I'm not going to keep you over. I'm going to run through them quickly, and that's unfortunate because, quite frankly, they're as important. The next ones are just as important as the first ones, but they're different. The original book stopped where we stopped, kind of. I'll explain that in a minute. The ones that I added were ones that I added because I believed that they were so important that they needed to be added as time went on. But two, the ones that I added, the next four in the leadership, the ship, are to talk about the ship, meaning you as captain of that ship. What are the things you have to do or feel or believe to make you an effective captain of the ship? And by the way, that's the first time I've ever referred to it that way. And if it hadn't been for his using the word ship, I would have probably not thought about it. So you can tell I'm on the fly here, all right? So the next letter is S, and the next letter is radical. It's not as radical as love, perhaps, but it's radical. And the radical doesn't come with the letter, the word, because what I'm saying is that you have to have systems. But the reason I want you to have systems may be considered radical. And I believe that structure can free the creative mind. And if you deserve to be a leader, you better be creative, because everything is going to be different every day, like it or not. And in this COVID crisis, we've learned that in spades, no question about it, all right? But here's the point. I know when I started in the world of work, I knew that there was a certain amount of structure that was necessary, but I always had been kind of taught to believe that too much structure stifles the creative mind. If you put too much structure, too many boxes around things that you do, then you don't have room to go outside the box, right? And we talk all the time about we want people who think out of the box, all right? All right. And so the box tends to be systems and tends to be processes, all right? Well, I will tell you that I totally disagree with that definition of what a system is. System provides structure so that I can be me. As just a trivial example, all right? I use a to-do list to make sure I do what I'm supposed to do. So it's a system, all right? But the reason the to-do list is important to me is that I don't have to think about what I have to do today, because I know what I have to do. It's on the to-do list. So I'm structuring what I have to do. But once I get through the to-do list, once I get through the stuff that I know has to be done, this mind is free to be creative about the strategy and about the future. So in my mind, the reason you want systems is to free yourself up, not to constrain you, not to box you in, but to free you up so that you can be creative. You can actually have a box to contain the routine so that you can move out of the box to be creative about the non-routine. To think about, how do I change the process to be better, more efficient, more productive? So for me, systems is a way of freeing me up, not a way of boxing me in. And as long as we think about systems that way, as an enabler of creativity, as opposed to a stifler of creativity, then we've got the right framework, and we need We need all the systems we can get. So I stress, you as a leader need to systematize your life so that you can be free to be able to be creative, to be able to think outside the box. In order to think outside the box, you have to have a box so that that which needs to get done in the box gets done. The H. H is something that, believe it or not, the last thing in the world anybody who knows me would have expected me to put H into this mnemonic. All right. And the reason is because it stands for humor. And nobody would say that Jerry is a jokester. As a matter of fact, Jerry doesn't remember jokes. I literally, if you tell me a joke today and I laugh my head off about it, tomorrow when I think about it, I won't remember the joke. All right. I am not somebody who makes jokes. So it's obvious that I'm not talking about being a jokester. What I am being serious about is that I have a tendency, this is why I say most people would not expect me to say this, I have a tendency to be intense, right? Look at that smile on her face. Everybody look at Raylyn. She's covering up the smile on her face, all right? The fact is, I have a tendency to be intense. I am an intense human being. When I get wound up about something, I'm wound up, all right? When I get committed to something, I'm committed. I'm an obsessive compulsive about achievement and doing things and doing them well. So when I tell you to lighten up, I'm serious. What we can't afford to be is so intense, so focused on intensity and seriousness that we think that everybody else is going to be that way every minute of the day. There is nothing worse than for people to walk into an office uptight. And I don't want anybody who works for me to ever be uptight. I would like to think that even though I can't tell a joke, I can be funny. All right? There's a difference between telling a joke and being humorous. And we have to lighten up. We have to be able to have a culture in the organization that we're responsible for that is not so intense itself that it gets wound up and tight. Tight organizations, I mean wound up tight organizations, tend to make more mistakes than ones that are loosey-goosey, all right? And when I say loosey-goosey, I mean not tight. And so in my mind, I actually was talking to somebody about this the other day. I don't know how many of you are either golfers or tennis players, but one or the other, probably a lot of you. And a long time ago, when I was playing tennis, I got to a stage where I was a B+ A- player, but I just couldn't proceed. I couldn't get better. And so I would take on all the A+ players and I'd get whooped every time. Never had a chance. But it was probably making me a little bit better, but I just wanted to win once in a while. And I discovered a book. And that book was called The Inner Tennis. And by the way, the author's name, for those who are going to take a reference here, is a guy by the name of Galway. It's an long time ago. And that book basically talked about operating in the zone. And the zone was a not uptight me. The zone was let loose, let it free, stop being so tight. And it was a phenomenally well-written book, and it was thoughtful and insightful. And quite frankly, I read that book and actually studied that book. And I went out and beat the best player I'd ever beaten the next time I played tennis, because I was in the zone and found a way to get in the zone. Now, I have to admit, I didn't get back into the zone that often, so I ended up being mediocre after all. But as a practical matter, you can't have your people uptight and expect them to be able to really be successful. They need to be loose enough to be in the zone to achieve. And we have to understand that no matter how intense we are, we have to have the humility of recognizing we don't know everything. We're not perfect. We're going to make mistakes. Half my humor comes from self-deprecating observations about my idiocy. The bottom line is we have to be willing to admit that we're not perfect. If I'm going to make judgments about others, I have to make judgments about myself. I have to know who I am and where I'm going and what I'm about and what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. One of the things I used to do as a leader all the time was to make sure that where I knew I had weaknesses, I had somebody working for me who could cover me, who was better at it than I was. The I, in my opinion, the I is the most important core value of everything that I've talked about so far today. I am a core value guy. Whenever I've taken over an organization, the first thing I do is try to work on developing the values of the organization. What are the core values of the organization? And for me, this is the core value. All right. There is nothing to me that's more important than my integrity. Not only my integrity to myself, my integrity to everybody who works for me. And so I believe that you have to begin every action with a commitment to integrity. So everything I've told you, you have to believe it to do it. If you don't believe what I've told you, then you will not do it well. If you don't have integrity, your people will know it quickly. If you aren't truthful, honest, straightforward, if you aren't there and they can depend on your integrity, they will see through your fraudulent behavior quickly. People catch frauds easily. When you work for a fraud, you'll see it quickly. If you are a fraud, you will be discovered quickly. So without belaboring this point, I cannot stress enough how I believe that at the heart of everything you do as a leader, the number one thing that you have to have is integrity. Your people need to trust you implicitly. And the only way that they can trust you implicitly is for you to be trustworthy, meaning worthy of their trust by proving every day that you have a line you will not cross, that integrity is at the heart of everything you do. I know that sounds like moralizing. I'm sorry. I believe it so deeply that it has to be there. It's at the core of everything I do. I don't want anybody who works for me to ever say, I never know what Jerry's going to say because he's just all over the ballpark. I want them to know that they can believe that what I say is what I believe. And I don't ever want anybody to have a question about where my head is. But to finish off the last part of SHIP, and again, it's a P, not a T, is passion. And I have to tell you that when we talk to board candidates for not-for-profits, and frankly, when I talk to people who are someday going to work for me, I need to get a sense of what their passions are. And I need to know what they are and how they're driven by their passion. Because quite frankly, passion drives what we think is important. If I have a passion for something, it trumps other things in my life. If I have a passion for governance and leadership, I commit to governance and leadership. I'm not doing this session with you because leadership is something that I just wrote a book about one day. I'm doing this session because I have a passion about the topic. And it drives me. Quite frankly, it causes me to do things I shouldn't be doing. Passion. All right. I have a problem. My wife reminds me of it all the time. And that is, my problem is I don't know how to say no. And she's been nailing me with that for my entire marriage to her, and it's been a long time. Because every time I turn around, if you come at me with something that I have a passion about, I don't know how to say no. I just don't know how to say no. And so I have had a tendency to overcommit. That's probably an understatement. My wife thinks it's a gross understatement. But I just believe in things. I believe in things. Things are important. Some things are important to me. And when they're important to me, it makes all the difference in the world where I put my resources and where I put myself. And as this expression says, that passion drives purpose, and purpose drives performance. When I have a purpose, the purpose is that I'm passionate about it and it drives me. So this P could have been purpose. It could have been purpose, but I believe that purpose without passion is nothing more than a dream. Only way purpose works is if you have a passion for the purpose. So in my mind, at the heart of being able to be driven by your purpose is you have to have a passion for that purpose. It can't just be a word or a set of statements. My purpose for existence is, my purpose in being in this business is, my purpose for my work life is, my purpose in my marriage is, my purpose in my life is. If all of those words just are words on a piece of paper or articulated, and there's no passion behind them, the purpose is lost. And nothing comes of the purpose. Your purpose. So in my mind, it is critical for us to keep in mind the fact it drives us. And if it drives us, then it is the way that we achieve the performance results that we all want to achieve. So that's the ship. Now, let me comment to you that the original book was not leader, it was leaders. Before I made it leadership, it was leaders. And the reason it was leaders is because there was another S. So I don't know what to do with this S in the mnemonic, leaderships. It just didn't work for me. So I just tack it on. But there was another S in the leaders in the original book. And that other S was self. Because what I said and what I'm saying to you now is that all of the things that I said we should do for the people who work for us, we have to do for ourselves. We have to set expectations of ourselves. We have to make sure that we're doing a job that's the right job for us. We have to be assured that we have the ability to evaluate ourselves. We have to be sure that we're working to develop ourselves. And by the way, development can be just, I have a weakness, I'm going to go fix it, or I need to know something more that I don't know now, so I'm going to go study it. I'm going to go learn it. I'm either going to go read a couple of books about it, or I'll take a degree in it, or I'll whatever. We're going to continue to develop ourselves. And by the way, the expectations have to be, what do I expect myself to be tomorrow, not just today? And then you have to have a systematic way of managing your life. You have to keep a good humor about yourself and keep that humility about yourself. You have to always have integrity, and you always have to have passion. So when I close out this process, I close it out with saying, lead yourself, leaders. Make sure that you give yourself the same leadership that you're supposedly given to others. And that means all of these things. Lord knows it's a long list. And I know that I'm not perfect at all of them. I know I'm weak in some of these things, but I keep working at it because I'm trying to develop myself. How many of you know what aloha means? Heather, what does it mean?
It means a lot of different things. I'm actually Hawaiian, so it means hello, goodbye, and love, and it's basically a cultural way that we as Hawaiians live by.
Well, Heather, aloha to you.
Thank you.
And I can tell you that I lived in Hawaii for 7 years.
Mhm.
And how long you been gone?
Oh, my father was born and raised there since before it became
You never lived
United.
there? You didn't live there?
I go there every summer since I was a kid.
Okay.
Spend time
Okay.
with family.
Okay, good. All right, well, I want everybody to know that she is absolutely right. It does mean all three things. But my use of the word has everything to do for the fact that love is not a dirty word.
That's great.
It's a 4-letter word, but it's not a dirty word. All right. And that aloha, the beauty of the word aloha in the Hawaiian culture is that it does mean all three of those things. And if you think about it, if I say aloha to you and you're leaving, I'm not just saying goodbye, but I'm saying I love you. If I say aloha to you and you're coming and I'm arriving, it means I love you. I love being with you. So the integration of those three thoughts is a beautiful part of the Hawaiian culture. And I can tell you that I want you to have aloha for every human being that you work with in your organization and who works for you. If you have that sense of aloha, if you have that sense of loving them as human beings, you will be a better leader. Trash. Because it was on a trash can, all right? It actually meant thank you for putting your trash in here, dummy. But as a practical matter, all I can say to you is that I want to thank you for your intensity of listening. Thank you for being here. And thank you for caring enough about leadership to put up with 2 hours worth of me talking about it. And thank you for putting up with the idea that you're part of a group that's focused on leadership. Thank you for doing that because it's good for the community. And I want to thank you all for that. I'm done. I made it in time. Braylyn, put that down in your book. Put that down in your book. I made it.
Jerry, you are so fantastic as usual. That's why we love to bring you in, even to talk to our board members who are all great leaders in their own capacity, but you still have so much to offer leaders at every level. So we're so lucky to have you for Leadership Delray. And I know I've been getting messages from everyone throughout your whole presentation. I love the presentation. I'm riveted. I have to have it. Can you send it? So can you send the presentation so we can forward it to everyone?
Oh, sure. I'll send it. It's
Okay.
it's all in here.
It's in the book, you guys. You
It's
all
in
have
here.
the book.
It's all in here.
It is, and the book is really, and it's quite easy to read because they have the work leaders tips, on every 5 or 6 pages or so. So it really encapsulates what the points are. So you do have it in the book. That's why we gave it to you. So did you
Okay,
take a
well,
look
listen,
at the chat?
Thank
Yeah,
you so much, everybody. And
lots
thank
of
you,
things.
Stephanie. I
Are
appreciate
you going to
the
join
comments.
us?
Thank you.
Are you joining us for lunch?
No, I'm sorry, I can't. I'm overcommitted.
We wanted to see you in person. Oh, I wonder why. I know. Yes, Dr. Heal Thyself. I have the same issues myself.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
totally understand. Well, thank you,
Take care,
Jerry.
everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
So everyone, we're gonna take a break now, and you've got an hour to get over to Arts Garage. I expect Marjorie Waldo will beat you all there, since she's there right now. But we're gonna have the mayor is gonna come and speak to you. My chair for the Chamber of Commerce is gonna be there. also the executive director of the DDA and the executive VP of the CRA. So they're going to tell you a little bit about their organizations, but mostly they're just going to talk to you about leadership. And so what I want you guys to do is remember your leadership quote. We'll just go around the room while you're having lunch. We've got a great lunch that's going to be catered for you. And we'll just talk a little bit about what leadership means to you while we're having lunch. And then we'll get to hear from our city leaders. So we'll see you all in an hour at Arts Garage. Bye.